parallel again to what cartoonists do. When they're mapping out a story, they're mapping out a story in time and in space at the same time. This is a pencil page by Chris Ware, one of the foremost cartoonists these days, where in that same building you'll follow a story in time as well as on every different floor in space. In the children's book, there's an element of turning the page and time passing and the story unfolding in time, and sometimes it can be a 1-2 movement, as in this Curious George. When a cartoonist uses all of those possible axes to map out his or her story, you can get very rich nexus of information. This is a page by Winsor McCay. That's the kind of thing that art courted me with. This is a counter-example. This is a not especially just a run-of-the-mill children's book about the princess and the pea, with this text and pictures juxtaposed, and when the artist is representing the princess lying in the bed, chooses to represent that in a double-page spread with an horizontal row of window. Whereas when we asked Barbara McClintock to tell that same story of the princess and the pea in the Little Lit, she chose a panel shape for the princess going up in her bed that made you physically feel that the height of that space. And then she uses, next to that, she uses the stage to give you 3 moments of a little dance that happens between the prince and his parents discovering that the princess did not sleep. And this kind of specific proscenium stage with the character acting out is very similar to a puppet show that you would have had for the illiterate people. This is a lot of information is being conveyed by the body gestures, by the facial expression, by the placement of the panels next to it. That was a TOON book by Agnès Rosenstiel, French cartoonist. In another TOON book, Jeffrey is here tonight actually. Jeffrey is a master cartoonist, and he uses the space of the comic page to show that dance between his characters and the relative positions of them and the shape of the panel and the tilt of the panel and the sound effect. One of the advisors to the TOON book, one of the educators that we work with, Dr. Tversky, talks about comics as a multimodal medium, which is very congenial to a young child because that's how they perceive the world. When you say to them, dinner is ready, it's not just what the words say, but also the tone, the pitch, the context, the fact that the stomach tells them it's dinner time. So much so that comics use a kind of universal language. Right now we're doing our TOON books. This is a TOON book done by Art in different languages on our website. So here is the same sequence in English and in Russian and in Chinese and in Spanish. And you can read the interaction between the character even if you don't understand the language, which makes it something, again, very much of a first medium for kids to get into books because they have all of those different points of entry. And finally, to make it even more relevant to children is the fact that it is drawn by hand. I think that many kids, when they read comics, fall in love with them, and the first thing that they want to do is that they want to make their own book and write their own story. And that's one thing that we're doing on our website actually, is letting them do their own cartoons. And that's not a reaction that they have with watching an animation or a movie, but I think somehow they perceive the handwritten quality of comics, and also that it allows you to use your imagination to, as this is from the Treasury of Comics, that you can open up to other people's point of view and the in this instance, an ant, and see the world from their vantage point. So from this love of everything that the medium could do, we decided to gather the greatest kids' comics from the golden age. And do you want to take it from there?
Okay. So I would read comic books to first Françoise and then to my kids, and she would read me synopses of the Scientific American articles that she was getting on neuroscience and cog-sci, and pulled us both toward applying the things we had learned in doing Raw to being of some service, to bring comics back as something kids could read, because, as I think Françoise ably demonstrated, there's things to learn that are really useful as part of like being literate in the 21st century. Back in the 20th century, back in the 20th century, comics were a giant mass medium. You know, everybody read comics, and there were lots of them in mid-century. But they weren't really appreciated as a learning tool. At that time, it was librarians who hated comics. Now they're the biggest champions of comics because it gets kids to walk past the computer terminals and pick up something that looks suspiciously like a book, you know? I know that I learned everything I know from comics. I learned to read from trying to understand if Batman was a good guy or a bad guy, and figured if I could just read the little squiggles above that evil-looking character's head, I'd find out. But then I learned about sex from Betty and Veronica. On the other hand, I did learn about feminism from Little Lulu, and learned about economics, as did our senators, from Uncle Scrooge. Learned my philosophy from Peanuts, and my politics from Pogo, and everything else from Mad Magazine. Because Mad Magazine is really important in this, because Françoise was talking a minute ago about the wising up that takes place in like a movie like Shrek, where it's all references and parodies without ever knowing what the original was. It's really something we had to think about when doing the anthology, because Mad formed me. I learned everything literally from Mad, including how to read Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse was a rodent. There was something dangerous in that Disneyland, like in the first panel where the cops are pulling off horse collar because he's not wearing the regulation white gloves. It was a way of moving past and understanding the symbolic language in which you were being indoctrinated, so that you were learning that underneath that Norman Rockwell veneer of America, here was how people got through the 50s. They were getting totally tanked. So that Dad is pouring beer between his legs. There's a fishbowl full of beer. The dog is lapping it up. The baby's getting fed some booze. In perfect Norman Rockwell style, as drawn by Will Elder and made by Harvey Kurtzman as a concept. And we decided when doing this anthology that we were after something else. We were trying to find that moment before kids were wised up, when they were just drinking in what stories could really be. I must confess that I was shaped by Mad, and before I met Françoise, and even when we were first working together, I was involved in passing along this kind of early indoctrination into irony as soon as I could. But as we had kids, I ironically stopped working for Topps Bubblegum a year after our first child was born. I began thinking about children and innocence, and it became a series of covers I made for the New Yorker, like these two. The colors look much better in print, as they do in the book that we're presenting tonight, than they do here. But the cover on the left, which was called The Guns of September, a back-to-school issue of the New Yorker, and this other one about kids playing, called News or Us, playing with newspapers, dealing with that loss of innocence. Now, the big threat to innocence in the 50s was comic books. Comic books, as one notoriously knows, and this is shown in this drawing by Robert Crumb, were something for parents to shred. They were even, as David Haidu pointed out in his 10-Cent Plague very clearly, where this photo is taken from, this was a comic book burning in